So before we get started, I just want to also caveat, the Asian American experience is so diverse in terms of country, language, culture, immigration patterns that we couldn't possibly cover all of that in just one session. So we're going to speak primarily to our own experiences. But it's an important moment. Right now, we just passed the 80th anniversary of the executive order for Japanese internment camps. Hate crimes against Asian Americans have risen 339% in the past year. In tech, we're often, despite our prevalence in the tech industry, we're often seen as smart, hard workers, but I don't know if they're quite the leader I thought they would be. And in media, TAF recently surveyed thousands of Americans to name a famous Asian American, and 42% of Americans couldn't name a single one. And for the ones that were named, number one on the list was Jackie Chan, who's not American, and Bruce Lee, who's been dead for 49 years. So it's a little bit grim out there. And so as tensions rise with China, I think things could get worse before they get better. That's why I'm really excited to have this conversation today. I'm really glad Mark, as soon as I texted him, was like, yeah, let's do it. Let's have that conversation here. And so I'm excited to have Jon, director of Crazy Rich Asians, In the Heights, soon Wicked, and also newly minted Chief Creative Officer of We. And Eugene Wei, early Amazon, founding member of Hulu, Flipboard, Oculus, and angel investor and prolific writer. So thank you both for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So Jon, I'd love to start with you and just talk a little bit about your upbringing and the role that identity played. Your parents had a Chinese restaurant.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about your upbringing.
Yeah, they still have the Chinese restaurant
Yeah.
in Los Altos in the Bay Area. So I grew up in the Silicon Valley. It's still there 52 years later. They came from Taiwan and China, met in the Bay Area at 19. My mom was 19. My dad was like 23. And I'm the youngest of 5 kids. And so food, story was all around me. I called the restaurant a house of stories. They'd tell stories to the customers. They'd hear stories from some of their investments came from hearing whisperings around the dinner table. But it was so we were always around that. And I remember seeing my dad be treated. At a restaurant, people think they're your servants or something. So they treat your parents, who are my parents are very strong, and you have 5 kids. So and I remember them being treated poorly by a customer and watching that and being very upset. And my mom and dad sat me down and they said, we started this in 1969 where there weren't Chinese restaurants in the area. We serve as ambassadors to what people think of Chinese people. So when they come in, they have to leave with their bellies full and their hearts full, so that the next time they see a Chinese family, they'll think differently about maybe when they came into here. And for good or for bad, that's what they needed to teach us to survive. That's what they needed for themselves. And for me, that was very heavy on our family, that we do represent something different, that we do have a responsibility. I was young, so I didn't fully understand that until I became a filmmaker and making movies and seeing what needed to be done and the importance of stories to represent cultures and people and understanding. So, but that definitely was in me the whole time.
Yeah. Eugene, you grew up in Chicago, probably a little fewer Asian Americans than in the Bay Area. What was it like, and what role did identity play in your upbringing?
Yeah, I am second generation, and so I am part of the. My parents were part of that huge wave of immigrants that came to the U.S. in the late 60s and 70s after the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965, which really fundamentally changed America and its composition. So prior to that, immigrants couldn't come over from a number of countries that were labeled as undesirable. And Hart-Celler kind of opened that up. So if you were to look in 1960, what were the immigrants coming to America? It was mostly from Western Europe and Canada. And then after Hart-Celler, you had a huge wave from Latin America, from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and then Asia. And so my parents went from China to Taiwan, and they came to the US where I was born. I actually did not, it's true, I did not encounter a lot of Asians in growing up in the suburbs of Chicago. It wasn't until I went to college that I even heard the term Asian American, which is a term that was come up with, by political activists in the late 60s in the Bay Area. And so I think for me, it's an ongoing process of figuring out, and I think for the entire community, it's like, oh, what does this term mean? Because there's so many different groups lumped into that who have all had different experiences.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because all those experiences back in the homeland are so different, but here we're united by this definition that was given to us. John, you talk about that identity and that idea to use food or film as a way to talk about culture. I know Jeremy Lin used to talk about wanting to just be a basketball player, known as a great basketball player instead of an Asian American basketball player, and kind of wrestling with that idea. Yeah. How has that been for you, wrestling with the tension of being a great filmmaker versus being a great Asian American filmmaker, and how's that impacted you?
I mean, that's like the plight of my life growing up. Like the whole time, I was usually the only Asian in the group, whether that was my basketball team or at animation camp or making my movies. And the whole time, the last thing you want to talk about is that you're Asian. Like the last thing you want to do when they make a joke is them look at you and expect you to laugh or do whatever. Like it was just, I just wanted to be Steven Spielberg. I wanted to be Tim Burton. I wanted to be Robert Zemeckis. Even when I went to USC, which is right down the street here, like I just wanted to be at USC. I did not want to be categorized. So it took me a while. It took me a while. And when I see and it's weird because I think we're in it I've evolved as a human being, I've grown up, but I think also our whole country has changed in a way that when I see other Asians when I was like in high school that were coming into the group, I give them the look like, don't fuck this up, bro. Come on, bro. Like, and then, and now I look back and I'm like, oh my, that's terrible. And now when I see another Asian on set, I'm like, I got you, bro. Like, like hang tight, do your best.
Yeah.
But I got you. Like, there's a camaraderie here that we're all in this together. Yeah. That we've all struggled in the same thing. When I used to pull up to studios here when I first got my first movie, they'd be like, oh no, deliveries are in the back. It was just not a reality that directors looked like me. And it was probably the way I dressed too, because I had like my hoodie. But anyway, so yeah, I think that now it's hard because I don't want to be I don't want to be someone who's just about being Asian. Yeah. I've got a lot of other things to say. And yet, when I made Crazy Rich Asians, it took me 10 years. I was in the business for 10 years before that, doing fine. I was making movies with big stars and big action movies with The Rock and blah, blah, blah. But at a certain point, me as a human being, as an artist, had to be like, oh, I actually don't. The whole time I was sort of living in my parents' philosophy of like, you got to earn your way here. You got to earn yourself here. You don't deserve it. You just got to earn it and show them. At a certain point after 10 years, I was like, oh, I know what I'm doing. I know why I'm here. I deserve. They actually are getting it off of me. So what do I want to do? And that's when I started looking at the things that scared me. And the thing that scared me the most was, who am I? My cultural identity crisis. And I found this book, Crazy Rich Asians, that had this delicious surrounding around it. Oh, the fascination with the rich and these crazy Asian people who are really rich. But that wasn't what attracted me. It was about worth and self-worth, and that this woman, Rachel Chu, going to Asia for the first time, which I recognize as that feeling, finding your worthiness. Maybe if they don't accept you here, and maybe they don't accept you there, but you can find your own way. And then we don't give answers in that movie. And so the fact that But this generation will come up with the answers for themselves. So I just loved that, and that was what drove me. It drives me to this day, this responsibility. And even with, now as a chief creative officer of We, which is an Asian e-grocery store, you can download the app anytime. #ad.
Download it right now. Yeah.
Which I've never really had a real job before, so it's kind of crazy. I have like a key card, I sit at a desk, and I go into meetings that I have no idea what they're talking about. But it's amazing because that, to me, everyone's like, when's the Crazy Rich Asians sequel coming? To me, We is the Crazy Rich Asians sequel, because everything everyone talked about Crazy Rich Asians was the food and the music, and can I hear more? Can I have more? Can I try? And now, and I had no ability to give them that. Now with We, I'm able to like, hey, get it delivered at your house. Try this, try this. My Filipino friends are sharing, lato with me or whatever, like all these different things. And I'm like, oh, I got to try this. So to me, bridging these gaps of story and sharing culture in a more physical way is probably another step for us, especially as cinema is going through so many changes.
It's interesting, though. I listened to a podcast. You mentioned one of your early student films had to deal with identity.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of gap in between where, you went on and made big films and then came back to that. Can you talk a little bit about that early experience?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about this until the last year or so, but right over there at USC, I saw a movie that a senior did, and it was about dating. And at the end of it, we were freshmen, and so we're watching this, and at the end of that film about dating, they opened all these doors to all these losers that she's dating. And the last door is an Asian dude. He doesn't even say a joke. They just open the door, and then she goes, no, and they close the door. And it was weird for me because I'm from the Bay Area, so I just didn't understand why the whole place was laughing. And I had to ask my friend, like, why are they laughing? And he's like, oh, because it's like, like an Asian dude. She's not going to date him. I'm like, that is what they're laughing? It blew my mind. So anyway, I made a short film. A few years later, I'm going to make a short film that goes against all of those things. It was called Guaylo, which is what they called me when I went to Hong Kong for the first time, which is like white devil. And I was so self-conscious about making it. It was a musical, and I got a huge, everybody loved it, but I felt so self-conscious making it. I wasn't ready to make a movie about my own cultural identity. I just didn't know how to show what I went through. People would question, is that real? Is that not? It was all real, but I couldn't. And so I never shared it. I never sent it to film festivals. And if you're a student, like you made a film, you better get it out there. And then instead I made a totally different musical about just mothers in general. And that got me into the business. I got rewarded for that, not doing it about my cultural identity crisis. I got into the business. I started making movies. And I never touched my cultural identity crisis again until 10 years later with Crazy Rich Asians. So it was hard to go back because I know that feeling when you're showing, even with Crazy Rich Asians, the first time I showed it, even to this day, I'm scared when other Asian people watch it because I know it will not satisfy everything, but I know I had to express something, and I know it's not everybody's perspective. But in a way, it's sort of, we just have to do the work.
Yeah.
Aren't dreams amazing? My parents came over, they didn't know a word of English. They didn't just like make a road they paved a giant freeway for me to get to LA to be in the most American business in the world, Hollywood. We can change so much. Asians weren't known for dancing until ABDC.
Yeah.
Like that wasn't like a thing that Asians did. And then all of a sudden, America's Best Dance Crew has Jabberwockies and Kabamar, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, Asians dance. Like we can change things so quickly, and that's what amazes me about our business. And as I get older, one movie, Crazy Rich Asians, can make 10 stars. Aquafina, Henry Golding, who wasn't even an actor, and Constance, and Gemma Chan, and Ronnie Chang, and Jimmy O Yang. Like, it's insane.
Yeah.
And so that's what keeps me going. It's like, actually, my parents were both wrong and right.
Yeah.
You don't have to prove yourself to deserve to be here and be treated properly. But at the same time, we have to put ourselves forward to show people who we are.
Amen. Eugene, on the tech side, so, people follow you on Twitter and they're like, oh man, Bill Gurley's like gushing about your writing. Things probably go pretty smooth for you. Can you talk a little bit about your journey through the tech industry and, perhaps how your identity played a role or impacted that positively or negatively?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the internet, I'm a Gen X baby, so the internet kind of came about when I was coming out of school. It wasn't like a thing that I thought I would end up working in. A lot of, the stereotype of second generation Chinese Americans, of which I was a part, was, go to med school, go to Harvard. I don't know, there was like a prescribed sort of like path that our parents wanted for us. But my parents, once they sent me off to school, they kind of loosened the reins a little, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna go work for this company called Amazon. They're like, I think no one had heard of it, and they're like, sell books online. They thought I was crazy, but I just kind of wanted to follow that wave where it was going because I was just spending all my time browsing the web. I was like, this is amazing. This is gonna be something, I think. And so I don't know. Like, I never thought about it when I got into it as, oh, I'm an Asian American within this industry, because the whole industry felt new to me. But certainly in a business context, you always look for role models. You look up ahead of you in companies. I was like, oh, okay, there are fewer East Asians, and so there's a sense in which you are. It's the same with the second generation Asian American experience in general. You're never sure what you're reclaiming because it doesn't seem like to be something that you're claiming. So, for me as a second generation Asian American, there's a way you're reclaiming your homeland culture, but you didn't grow up there. You grew up in America. I always say I'm like Chinese hardware running sort of like a hybrid American Chinese operating system. It's sometimes it's hard. You really don't know. And I think the Asian American community in general is always trying to figure out what that term means, because in a way, you look at Japanese, Korean, Filipinos, Vietnamese, like they're all very distinct cultures in some ways, but society tends to lump us under the term Asian. So our commonality tends to be how other people see us. I think in a corporate environment, I am conscious of, I think, one thing, which is, something we had talked about leadership, that there is a model of corporate leadership in tech, but in the business world at large in general, which really comes out of the post-World War II era in America, when you had a lot of people from the military come back to America and join the executive ranks at companies. And so our model of leadership is a lot driven by, this image of MacArthur or generals, this sort of like really charismatic and aggressive style of leadership. And I think in tech, we have our own sort of archetype of that, which is the sort of misunderstood genius, the kind of like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk type of model, which is like the more romantic, heroic model of that. But our economy is a lot, especially in America, moved from an industrial economy to more of a service, knowledge, information style economy. And it's not clear to me that leadership style is the always ideal. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I think, that's been something I grapple with, is like, oh, okay, like, is my style of leadership fit with the model of what the industry selects for?
Yeah. No, I often wonder, Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba, like if he had immigrated earlier here, would he just be a middle manager at a FANG company instead of given the opportunity to produce one of this generation's great commerce businesses? So I think that's really interesting. Moving to the rise in hate against Asian Americans. 40-year-old Michelle Go, just this year, Michelle Go shoved her to death in New York City off a subway platform. 35-year-old Christina Yuna Lee was stabbed 40 times in her apartment. I saw just yesterday, Gui Yingma was 61-year-old grandma who had a rock beat half her skull, and she just passed yesterday. And also yesterday, a 34-year-old Asian man was cut on the cheek twice in Queens, I think. And we're just 2 weeks away from the anniversary of the Atlanta shootings. What's going on, man? Why do you guys think this hate is on the rise?
I mean, I have no idea. I mean, I feel like there's a narrative that has always persisted as Asians being from somewhere else or being the invaders, I mean, from history. And we've never really fully confronted it. I mean, as little as jokes with my friends, some of my closest friends, making jokes. Even during the pandemic, a high school friend that I'm very close to sent an audio joke of a guy coughing until he had an Asian accent. And some of the hardest conversations I've had to have was not like coming here and saying how to stop Asian hate. The hardest ones are like talking to my closest friends and be like, because when all this stuff was happening, all this Asian hate sort of news was happening at least, he was like, hey, where should I donate? What can I do? And I was like, let's sit down for a second. I love you. I know you're not racist, but the jokes and the things that I used to laugh at, like, it's just not cool. This is the reason why it's built up over these years of continue to push it that way. And he took that. And I don't know if it changed him completely. And maybe anyone else, he would have like, oh, you're so sensitive, blah, blah, it's just a joke. But we got to have that real conversation. I think it's really on the ground for us. Yeah. I think it goes so elemental of what we see as Asians. And also, we were also taught, being born here, I was taught Asians are Asians. Even though I'm from a Chinese family, even though I understand the difference with Japanese, but we were grouped together, so I accepted that group together. Only till I'm getting older where I meet so many more that were my generation that have the dual identity that we get to really understand, oh, there's a lot of differences in here. So how do you stop Asian? I don't know. I think we can do a lot of, everyone has their own roles. Some people, their job is to yell and scream on Twitter, and my job isn't necessarily that necessary, but I'm in a position to make stories that maybe add a new dimension to what Asian is to Americans and to the world. That's the best I can do. Of course, we can speak up and amplify, and also with we to share, foods and share things, make us understand each other more. So you can either get on board with have empathy through going through trauma together and showing them the trauma you go through, or the flip side of that is having the best party, all-night party of the night, and the next day you're like bonded forever. And I feel like my stories are on that side. Yeah. Like, let's celebrate ourselves and who we are so that others want to like celebrate with us, and you go through the best. Let's go through joy. It doesn't mean the other's not right, but it just means we have different ways to accomplish the same thing. So I think everyone will have to find it themselves. That's the hard part of it all.
Yeah, but media is such a powerful tool. I 100%. Remember listening to Chef Dave Chang's podcast, and him and Pablo Torre, an ESPN reporter, were just talking about changing diapers for their kids. And I was running and listening to this podcast, and all of a sudden I was like, got choked up. I was like, I think this is the first time I've heard two Asian dads talk about just being dads and changing diapers. And it, for me, just hit on such a personal level.
I think number one is talking about everything, bringing it up. The number one thing in Crazy Rich Asians, well, not number one, but always brings up to me is when they're just driving in a car, no dialogue, the four friends hanging out at night. They're like, people are saying, I've never seen four Asian friends hang out at night in a movie before. Yeah, like that's crazy.
Yeah. Eugene, you and I were talking. Sometimes it feels like we have to fight every civil rights battle one race at a time. And you and I were talking. A lot of times, some people, even our friends, are like, "Hey, man, is this Asian hate? Like, is it really happening, or is it just coincidence?" Each one of these things, when the police chief for the Atlanta shootings are like, "Wait, let's not call it a hate crime. Let's make sure, before we call it a hate crime." I mean, why do you think that is? That oftentimes the things that are happening within the Asian American community might be discounted, and what can we do about it? Solve it today,
Yeah. I mean, it's such a hard problem because, in many cases, a lot of the attacks that have happened over the past 2 years, especially, we're finally getting documentation on video, which, has changed. It's not just for Asians, it's for all sorts of crimes, has really changed the dynamic, just the smartphone. And, now you've given it some physical form that seems difficult to deny. On the other hand, unless someone is shouting racial slurs or saying something, it is always a little bit of a mystery. Were they just attacked randomly? What caused it? In a lot of these cases, it's I don't know that we'll ever get deep certainty. I think this feeds into one thing that Asian Americans have always struggled with, which is a sense that in the sort of like more binary race dynamic of America, that Asians don't fit anywhere, or they're kind of invisible, or these things may happen, but how dramatic are they? That is difficult. And so at a first level, I think it's just the sense of recognition, or, like if you have people who are Asian in your life and things like this happen, is everybody seeks kind of, what Hegel talked about as mutual recognition, just like our lived human experience, that we exist, and then that's real. A more practical thing around this, which I took a training class on bystander training after there was the rise of attacks of elderly Asian people. I was just like, I was worried about my parents, and I thought it was going to be one of these boring mandatory training things, and I actually found it somewhat useful because you never know. Like, if an attack happens near you, most people get paralyzed. You don't know what to do. It's not a situation that we're just like instinctually meant to react to, and so most people just stand by and things happen. So as a practical measure, I find that useful.
Yeah, yeah. What are you feeling optimistic about?
It's what's amazing about America, and especially in the age of the internet, is that the cycle time on culture moves faster than I could ever imagine. So, people like Jon putting representations of Asians into culture. To me, I'm a cultural determinist. I'm also a technological determinist. I think those are the two biggest levers that move the world forward. And so, growing up Gen X, I never even saw any Asians in pop culture. If I did, it was, not something you really wanted to see. So it's great to have that. And I think, your kids are going to grow up. My nieces and nephews are growing up in a world that's already vastly different. You have things like Netflix where people are watching shows with subtitles. A lot of foods and things from our culture have been assimilated into America. I think America's great challenge, right, is we're the most diverse nation on earth. We're struggling always to come up with a pluralist way that we can exist in harmony. At times it seemed like that, like we've regressed on that in the past decade, but in other ways, I think the internet and other things like this are accelerating the ability for us to absorb that. So that's what gives me hope.
Jon, to close real quick, you have 3 young kids. As you think about the world that you hope they grow up in, what do you hope that they have that you didn't grow up with?
I always say the greatest story that I have to tell now is the story of the world to my children and the rules of the world. I was taught a very specific way from my parents. How do I want to adjust that for my kids? And I'm so encouraged when I see other artists out there, when I see the conversation out there. It's hard. It's frustrating. It's annoying to have these conversations, to hear it over and over again. It's also annoying to live in a life where you get it thrown at you all the time. But the only way out is through. And I want my kids to be tough, to go through those conversations, to not be afraid to feel sad, not be afraid to feel angry, not be afraid to get and do the work and have a conversation that they don't know the solution for after, that they don't have to push a button and to have it come true. We're doing Wicked, and Wicked is a lot about the wizard and how he paved this yellow brick road that you have to follow, and all your dreams will come true with him. But that's not actually solving anything. So I think we're in this big conversation, debate, and struggle together. And I want my kids to keep going through it and be okay with feeling uncomfortable and being okay with re-examining their rules and the story that I told them too later. If we can do that, that's the only way we move forward. You guys all know that. You create companies and invest in companies that are changing the world all the time. So we know how malleable that is. I've seen it. I've seen the levers being pulled on a movie, a Step Up film, where we're selling Flow Ride is Low, and no one has known that song, but we're going to make it cool on the radio, and we're going to make it cool on MTV, and it's going to become a song that culture loves. I've seen it happen, and it's manufactured in a way. And then I've also seen Crazy Rich Asians, where we didn't know what was going to happen, and then the community embrace it and the world embrace it, and it creates stars and create a whole new thing. It wasn't perfect, but it created an avenue for more things. And that's 4 years ago, and look at what's happened since then. So I have a lot of hope, but the only thing I can do is just the next step after the next one.
Amen. Thank you both so much, and thank you Upfront for having this conversation.
Thank you.